Hello, welcome back to Bioli Talks. Today my guest is Professor Hans Gutbrod, who already spent 25 years in the Caucasian region. And we had a very interesting and the conversation that makes you actually think about lots of subjects. I'm not going to tell you more about it. I just want you to listen to it, enjoy it, and let me know what you think. Let me present to you Professor Hans Gutbrod. Welcome, Hans, to Bioli. Bioli is the only wellness resort so far in Georgia. Mm-hmm. And its founder, Ramaz Bluashvili, who you just met, he's a visionary. And basically, what his vision is to create a wellness industry. He calls it Georgian wellness. And basically what he does, he uses old Georgian traditions like that we had in past. We even have songs, the healing songs, like you sing to the children and the coughing stops and everything. It's fascinating. So Ramaz wants to use old Georgian traditional medical practices and combine it to a modern medicine, and that's the idea of a Bioli Wellness Resort. And this tea right here is one of the examples. All the herbs in here are Georgian herbs. We have botanists go around Georgia, and gather the herbs, and we use them for the tea, food, and you name it, everything. So I would like you to have a Bioli tea, and thank you. We can go on with our interview. So. Again, oops, that's interesting. Where were you born?
I was born in Campinas in Brazil.
Wow.
So that's quite a different part of the world, but that was, and I lived there for the first 6.5 years of my life.
In Brazil. How did you end up getting born in Brazil?
Well, the joke that I sometimes say is that if I want people to do mental arithmetic in their own mind, then I tell them that I'm born in Brazil, and then you can immediately see that they calculate how old is Hans.
Yes.
And then how old were Hans's parents probably, and then they think, when exactly did the Germans come to Brazil? So in my case, the explanation is simple. The Brazilians had created very high import taxes for German cars, and the German car industry needed to move to Brazil.
Right.
And so Volkswagen and Mercedes moved to Brazil, and my father was working for a company that did supplies for these cars. Right. In the automotive industry, and they moved into Brazil in the late 60s or 68, and so that's why I was born there.
Wow, that's a nice place to be born. So you have been working in a Caucasian region for more than 25 years now.
Yes.
Why? How did you end up here? How?
I first came here to teach at university, and there were in the organization where I applied to teach, there were something like I think 18 or 20 countries to choose from. And very quickly became clear to me when I was trying to decide, this was essentially everything from Poland to Mongolia, that I looked through the list of countries. I didn't really know very much about Georgia, but I knew that I wanted to go to a place, originally just for a year, that had a fascinating history, that ideally had a literary history, that ideally was a place you would want to come back to. At the time I was only thinking about going for a year, but that it wasn't going to be just some kind of internship, the thing that you went for a year and then you said, I never want to go back again. Right. So anyway, that was in ¡99, and that's now, it's 2025.
You mentioned you were looking for the countries that had a interesting history.
Yes.
Well, we certainly have very old and interesting history. Why would, if you were asked, why should the world know more about Georgian history?
Yeah, I mean that's of course a topic that you can kind of have views on at any supra, and you'll hear about.
Supra, yes.
But I think genuinely it's a country because it does have a very old history, and it has an old literary history, and it's at the crossroads. Crossroads is an overused word, but in a way, when people look at the modern map, they see Georgia and then they see Azerbaijan, and in a way, Azerbaijan makes them forget that Georgia was right next to, together with Armenia, but was right next to, or in whatever way Armenia constituted itself, but was right next to Persia. Okay. And of course, Persia is one of the very, very big cultures of the world. Right. And of course, with an influence on Georgian literature, but with an influence on world literature and world culture. And it is one of the big, big civilizations. And so Georgia in that way has also been, it's just one of many reasons, but in many ways has been a place where at its very best, it's also been a place of synthesis, it's a place of encounters, often difficult encounters. It's not all that all of this is harmony, and that's inscribed in the history of Georgia. But that's just one of many, many reasons. And then, of course, more recently, it's because Georgia made the very, I think, brave attempt to break out of this kind of Soviet trajectory, away from what we see in Russia, and of course, that's still in contest today.
You know, you said that you came here to teach at the university. You still teach at the Leo State University. I would like to ask you this question: the youth. When you came 25 years ago, you dealt with young students, and you're dealing with them today. How are today's students different from 25 years ago?
Well, I mean, I've been lucky in the way that I've always met really great people. And so some of them, I gather, are your friends also, that's kind of studied Arabic languages. That was one of the places you went to. Yes, It was one of the places you went when you wanted good instruction way back then. I would say that one of the things that very obviously these centralized exams made it more possible for people that were maybe out in the regions and that worked really hard. And some of the other things, including some of the things that were generously made possible by, let's say, the US government, like these scholarships.
Right.
That this has become more broadly accessible to people that really worked hard, that got good exams, and I mean, what's impressive often is meeting people that kind of come from Kutaisi or come from Zuctiri and somehow have managed to make their own way into what makes the world available to them. As I said, I think that's more broadly possible now than it was, though of course education and the quality of education always is an ongoing topic. Not only here, that's the case everywhere.
I read you sent me your essay about, very interesting essay about Freedom Square.
Yes.
And it took me, for my generation, especially for me, today where I picked you up there's a school right in the corner. That's my school. I went to that school. That used to be a number 3 experimental school. Now I believe it's 50 years or something. And that touched my heart so deeply when I read your essay. And basically, I didn't live in Solovaki. I lived somewhere else. So I had to every day, as a kid, for 11 years, I had to take a subway, get out of the subway that was Lenin Square subway, because the Freedom Square today, we call it Freedom Square now, it used to be Lenin Square. There was a big, large statue of Lenin, for some reason holding a hat in his hand, I don't know. But, so every day I had to walk through the currently Freedom Square, go to Solovaki, go to my school. And looking at the scenery, that was my childhood. And then they destroyed everything. Everything you see on Freedom Square, 90% of the buildings are new buildings. They're not buildings that I used to look at. And we replaced Lenin with a St. George. And I never looked at it the way you look at it, the gift from Russia, like a Trojan horse from Russia, created by the Georgian sculptor who is very closely affiliated with Putin.
Yeah.
My question is, why did you get to that point? Why did you want to write that essay? What triggered to write that essay?
Yeah. Well, what triggered writing that essay was in some ways discussion in various places. So it was discussions in seeing the discussion in many places about how do you replace Lenin is a really, really important question. And what do you do with that? And let's say in Yerevan, there's nothing, there's emptiness. And some artists put out a little bit of grass and say that's the higher grass is a symbol of it. But it's an open discussion. And then in Yerevan, for example, people talked about putting Tigran Metz, the great Tigran, and others very rightly say this is not the symbol of a democracy. And in that particular context, I made the argument that the right thing would be to put the architect that created Yerevan, because that's a symbolism of it's somebody who worked hard and who kind of created a home for people. And then we saw similar, I started looking, of course, in Freedom Square also. Everybody walks past it a lot. I live in the vicinity. And sometimes when you walk past things all the time, they almost become invisible.
Right.
But when you do look around, and when you do realize that, say, the shop that sells expensive watches that practically nobody can afford in Georgia, and that is owned by the family of a former Armenian Minister of Finance. And then the other presence of money and power on that square, but not really so much the presence of citizens. And somehow everyone accepts these things, or because you get so used to it. But in some ways, I think sometimes the purpose of a discussion is also to reframe and look out and think how the symbolism in the end of something that's called Freedom Square. If it was just called, Random Square, it would be something else, but it's meant to symbolize freedom. And in a way, the freedom, it's a freedom for big cars, it's a freedom for very rich people, and it's not really the freedom that I think people would really identify with. And people have, when you ask and do small surveys, you find that people have quite mixed feelings about that square at the moment also.
And you say in that essay that people must shape their symbols themselves.
Yeah.
What do you mean by that?
Well, one idea, for example, that I had at the end of the essay, and that took off from something that happened somewhere else, that maybe a way of having a public discussion would be to have a competition for people under 25 to come up with ideas. So if you have the competition for everyone, then the big artists or big architects are going to say, well, but who's in the commission? Should I go in? Will this be an embarrassment if I, with my... But in a way, the people that are under 25 now, they'll have to live with this. And so for them to come up with the ideas, and if in the end that no viable idea is there, then no viable idea is there. But I think it's important to also fill the space with positive content, and also to give to opportunities to people in that. And so that was just one idea that people could think about what are new ideas? That could be a different version of St. George. It could be a different figure. It could be, but even that discussion in itself, I think, is very important.
And I think we have a situation like that because we're still living through the parts of Soviet mentality, where in Soviet Union, no one would come up with an idea like that because government would decide everything. People, you eat, drink, have fun. It's not your business. And so we're still in there. Like even today when I talk to people here, let's say mayor does something, he's driving and does something wrong, police shouldn't stop mayor.
Yeah.
Of course not.
Yeah.
And people go, no, that's Soviet. That's very Soviet. And I think what you're saying is gonna change Georgia. If we go to that point where young people have ability to reshape their symbols, the way you say, it's going to be great. And my question is, it's actually perfect. Many times, people here in Georgia, they see examples like there was a prime minister of Austria riding bus to job every day, and there was a prime minister of Netherlands spilled the coffee and he helped to clean it up. Things like that really excite people here, and they post on Facebook, and there's a discussion and they're comparing to Georgian authorities. What should we do to get to that point? What do you think?
Yeah, that's a very big task, of course. But I think what everybody can do is just already think of ways. And we see this. We see this with many thousands of people, tens of thousands of people in Georgia who get engaged in that way. And whether that is, one of the things that I care about is stray dogs. And then you go out to Kakheti, to some village. And in that village, there's a There's a doctor and she cares about the stray dogs there, and then you help to vaccinate, etc. So there are many, many very good things. And I think in difficult times, and of course these are difficult times in around the world, but I think it's also important to look to these examples and find one particular thing that you care about. And this doesn't need to be something where you have an expectation that you will change everything at once. But if you care about one particular thing, you know, you clean up one particular area, maybe of a beach in Tbilisi,
right,
because where you like to go, or you look for one particular kind of monument or one particular historical figure and try and collect a little bit. And there are big national topics, but there are often also really quite local topics of things that we can get excited about, or writers or figures. And there are many ways in which people, and I've written about this also, but I mean, you know, practically everybody can contribute to Wikipedia, can contribute Wikipedia knowledge in Georgian that is not available for Georgians, that may be available in other languages, or knowledge about Georgia in languages where it doesn't exist, and that can be English, of course, but it could also be other languages. And there's a lot. This is one of the good things about Georgia, one of the great things about Georgia. If you are in a place like Berlin, or in London or so, in many ways, a lot of things are discovered, a lot of things are studied, there's a lot of institutions. In Georgia, if you want to get engaged on one particular thing, there's also a lot of opportunities, a lot of things that haven't been written about, people haven't asked questions. And what's really important is, I think, also to do some of that right now, because your grandparents are just still around, your parents and grandparents, and some of those memories will be lost. Yeah. And if I can just mention one example, I mean, with my students, we're creating at some point in English the Wikipedia entry for the Writers' House of Georgia, right, the Pretty House in Machiavelli. This was 2 years ago, and it took us about 25 minutes to do it. So we had discussed why this place is so important, and the story of Bioli. Mm-hmm. For those that don't know, I mean, most of your audience will, but maybe some don't, a very important poet from Imereti who committed suicide to escape the purges, but which was a very, very important symbolic act. He's not a saint, but I think it's correct to describe him as a martyr, and in a very, very important figure. And so created that Wikipedia entry, and then we walked to, at some point, I felt we needed a better photo. And so I went to the writer's house and took a photo just with my phone and uploaded it. 3 months later, I get a link from a friend who lives in London and says, you might find this article interesting. And I open the link, and it opens an article on the Financial Times, opens up. And it's about what goes on in the culture sector, the negative things that go on in the culture sector. Right. And it has a picture, and I'm thinking, I know this picture. And it was a picture of the writer's house. And it turned out it was actually the picture that I had taken, because sometimes newspapers use Wikipedia. So it's just one example where, you know, you did something that took a few minutes, and then somehow it ended up creating, you know, became the picture that people used.
Yeah. Well, we set up this interview on Rustaveli Avenue. Tonight will be day 63 of non-stop protest. The people are protesting literal Russification of Georgia. I mean, unfortunately, if someone told me when I was 13 years old and I would sneak out of my school and stand on Rustaveli Avenue, because that's when the April 9 things happened, and that was the first ever demonstration that we have actually saw. If someone told me that in 2025 I'll be standing here again, you know, fighting against Russification of my country, would never believe it. But well, this is the reality. A lot of people say that what's going on down there is kind of like a process of shaping up a new Georgia. Would you agree?
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think whether that has a success, let's say in 5 months or maybe in 2 years, that people coming out and standing up, and also coming out when they don't know that there's an immediate result. They do it because it is the right thing to do, and that you just persist on that. I think that that's very important, and that kind of symbolizes that people feel that this is their country. It also, I think, stands for something that the people, in a way, there's an optimistic vision there about what Georgia can be. And this is why I'm also optimistic about these protests in a way. There is what the Kremlin today stands for is that a handful of people want to just grab things. And yes, they often mobilize a lot of support in the society, but it's not something that's actually centered on citizens. And what we see there with the art, with people being friendly to dogs, with music, with the singing that you participate in, yes, we just see something that people actually have an optimistic vision and also say we can be a better place, even in difficult times. And that, I think, in the end, that doesn't immediately prevail. You need a lot of persistence. We have examples of countries where it didn't prevail, but I think it's very, very important for a country.
And I mean, you just mentioned Kremlin, and how deep do you think the roots of what's going on today in Georgia go in history? You studied, Caucasian region deeply.
Well, I mean, in some ways, I think in some ways you could say it goes back at least to 1795. Yeah, because that's interesting that you have. There are not that many cities that have had as traumatic an experience as Tbilisi had in 1795. It was essentially, this was more than Hiroshima. It was more than what happened in Dresden. It was more than what happened in many, many other cities. It was essentially the experience of Troy, exactly, like in the Iliad, where the entire city is obliterated, people are taken into captivity, and so that there is a deep, deep rupture there, and I think that also informs a lot of the fears, so to speak, and that's one of the reasons why people are afraid in this particular context. And if you're if you have authoritarian tendencies, you play on fear. So it goes back at least to that, and I think, every other probably 10, 15 years you can pick up another root, exactly, in there. And again, we see some roots, of course, that connect to the more recent past there also. So this is, I think, there are multiple different ways of telling the story, and none of them are necessarily exclusive to each other. But I think getting your own relationship with the past in a way right, getting a plausible version of that includes different components, I think that's very, very important for a country. And so it's also, I think, about, in Rustaveli, these things are about the future, but they're also about understanding one's own past.
Well, you studied very closely Georgian culture, and I know you appreciate it very much. Mm-hmm. And how important do you think is Georgian culture, in this case, Georgian culture, in building new and democratic Georgia for the future?
Well, at least any attempt that you would have needs to, of course, to connect to that. There are a couple of things that are great in Georgian culture. I think Georgians across different contexts often, not always, mm-hmm, but often can socialize quite well. That's not the case necessarily in other countries that are often quite stratified. And of course, Georgia also has a very strong sense of who's in various places, but people can connect across that. And we talked about the supra, and of course there's a lot of psychologizing about the supra that has its own problems, some of these ways of doing that. But one of the great things about it is that it tends to be a culture that seeks accommodation. I don't think it tends to be a culture that valorizes, so to speak, a particular version of cruelty, and there are cultures that do that. And so there are a lot of resources and positive things one can build on. Mm-hmm. Of course, you can always identify things that stand kind of against various bits, but this attempt to get on with each other and to kind of seek some kind of accommodation, which is, I think, normally what that stood for, and what early aspects of the Georgian dream, I would also say, had that more strongly. Yeah. Now we have a much more radicalized vision of that stands in, I think, in stark contrast. I don't think that the Georgian dream stands, if I may say so, stands for a strong vision of what that's really very traditional. I think there are very deep contrasts there.
I agree. The Bolnisi Museum. I read a great article about Bolnisi, or your article. A gem that you have to visit even if you're in Georgia for a few days. Why?
Well, as I wrote there, I mean, there are museums that you see them and they provide a good entertainment for that moment. There are museums that go there and they change the way you look at at history and at yourself in a broader context. And Bolnice, or Tbilisi Bolnice, is of course a totally unique place. It is in some ways one of the places where you can see the longest journey of humankind from the first people that one found there to the present day, and throughout that with very, very different histories and moments. We have these in Dmanisi, that location of these people that somehow try to survive as hunters and gatherers. We then have Saktrisi as one of the first gold mines, unfortunately not around anymore, but then we have this moment, and I think this is very, very well done in the museum also, some of the gravestones from Seljuk area, right. And with that inscription, be meek or be humble because life is transitory. And you stand there and you see all of these layers of history, and then we have the history of the German settlers who celebrate and who of course didn't know that they were doomed also in their own way. And so that arc of history, that really, it's not just a good museum, it's an extraordinary museum. I think that any person should really go there because it's not just a history of Georgia, it's a history of mankind, it's a history of humanity that you can see there.
Thank you for that, because I'm sure probably lots of children in Georgia have never been there. And their parents or teachers never looked at it that way.
Yes.
The Museum of the Mankind, not just
yes.
small Bolnice Museum.
Yeah.
Thank you. I appreciate your input about that. And you mentioned before another Museum of Repressed Writers.
Yes.
And you have another great article, and the story of Paolo Iashvili. You already talked about that, but in your article you mentioned that there was lots of support creating the Paolo Iashvili exhibit. One of them being the financial support from the United States Embassy. How important do you think for Georgia to work with embassies or foundations or international donors to have museums like Bolnice, for example?
Well, I think that's, how can I say, I think it's always important to work with others. And it's yes, embassies and donors, but it's also sometimes the look from the outside. So the Bolnice Museum, there's a young relatively young Colombian French expert who worked on that. And when you're in one particular place, it can often be hard to tell your own story because you have 1,000 different ideas that this should be there, that should be there. There are all these things that you want to bring to the fore, and it is often in conversations with people that look at things and that help you shape that. And so I think the reason why this is so important is because sometimes people think that trusting others means that you lose your identity. And I think this is an example.
Yes. The
Bolnice Museum can be an example. There are other examples also that sometimes trusting others can help you find your identity. And that's a very, very different message from that we hear from the nativists who somehow say, oh, we need to keep all of these other people away because they're going to take something away. And yes, you need to be careful. And this is in a challenging time. Trusting everybody doesn't necessarily work, but developing relationships so that you can engage in that and that you can find yourself and discover aspects that you hadn't realized, I think that's important. And I should say, though, that there's also one gem or one thing that Georgia has, which I think is extraordinary, which is that some museums have not really been discovered, and people don't really go there a lot, whether that's for Nikoladze, the sculptor, or whether that's the Mikhail Jabakhishvili House Museum, which is tended to by his grandson, and there's not that much left. But even just talking to the grandson is an extraordinary experience, and there's a huge amount that people can discover in Tbilisi, even for people who've been around for a long time.
So interesting. Going back to Rustaveli, and we've seen, like yesterday, for example, there was a great art performance which really attracted people, and people felt happy and different. We still have a problem in Georgia that people don't understand how important is a freedom of speech and freedom of expression. do you say?
Yeah, I mean, one of the positives about that in the end result is that art, in a way, is art and literature and reading closely and understanding closely is something that people have then developed over time. And whether those are the novels of Bluashvili or other novels, right, and reading them with a particular degree of attention, I think or I mean, if you look at the art that's in the just off Rustavelli, or right where people go into the cafe in that art museum,
yes,
that in itself, I mean, you can read that entire arc of time. I think what's important is in a way that right now so much of that discussion gets soaked up by Facebook. And that is one of the challenges that we live in. How do we get conversations to extend beyond particular groups in a particular mode of engaging that right now we have on social media? That's not just a problem here, we have that everywhere, but it would be a big challenge.
Yes, and my next question is, in 2015 I established a foundation called NOVA. It's a foundation for promoting science, and my main interest is to promote science among children. And we've done a lot of projects. I took children to NASA. I brought people from NASA here. Lots of engagement. I myself do lots of public lectures around the country. My question is, how important is science? Maybe it's very vague question, but when I talk to children here, they don't understand, why should I become a scientist? Mm-hmm. Why should one think about becoming a scientist?
I think it's essential, and I myself have contributed to, in my old boarding school in the Black Forest, I've contributed to a new science center, even though I don't have a science background myself. Because I think that's the challenges that we're going to face, the challenges that Georgia itself also faces, the many questions that aren't resolved, and having your own local science space, I think, is incredibly important. It's also very important, I think, it's something I think sensible to recommend to students, because as a scientist, you ideally have a degree of freedom, you have a degree of mobility and flexibility. You can go to different places if you really know what you're doing. And that, of course, is the origin of the university also. I mean, people traveled across various places to study. And so this is, I think, in default, I think people should get interested and be interested as early as possible in their life. What they then decide to do with that later, that's a different question. But having the basics in mathematics, in other fields, if you only start getting interested when you're 25 years old, that's harder. Yeah, that's much harder.
And yes, speaking of science and technology, today one of the most talked about subjects is artificial intelligence.
Yes.
Well, recent news was now China created new artificial intelligence. Now we have another space race kind of thing between AIs of the world. And for you, as a writer, as a teacher, what is AI? Is it some sort of a new tool or a problem?
I mean, everything's an opportunity, ideally. That's the way you should look at it. Mm-hmm. And one of the things that I think we should strengthen more is, especially in a context like Georgia, to think about how can universities contribute to society and who should figure out what AI can do and cannot do. So some of my university colleagues, not so much in Georgia where people are quite open, but in other places, try to keep AI, kind of think how can we get students away from AI. And in a way, my own approach has been a bit different, where I've told students, okay, let's write this paragraph differently. Everybody has 15 minutes. Use whatever AI tool you want, and then let's compare the results. So universities should be places to figure things out. Yeah? And I think people often look at universities just doing more of the same, which is teaching and certifying, kind of testing students, when really it should be a place to figure things out and figure out, for example, how do they work in Georgian? And to me, I've sometimes used that to engage, to create basic dialogues or sometimes mid-level dialogues in Georgian and figure that out. And then just recently compared with sitting with Lasha Bakadze, and we were looking at different versions, and he says, well, it's getting the ergative case wrong in this particular thing, which is not something I would spot. Yeah. But that discovery, does a Chinese AI, does it also speak Georgian? Does it not speak Georgian? What parts of Georgian history does it know about? So the Chinese version of AI already knew about Bioli and had relatively accurate and say critical assessment, even though in other aspects of human rights, the Chinese AI is not interested. It's not interested in these questions. But that's something we should figure out. And yes, it's going to pose new challenges, but there's so much to do. There's so much, I mean, people, in so many cases, also in Georgia, they could probably live 10 years longer. They could live more healthily. There's so many things that we actually need to solve and that people should be engaged in solving. I don't think we're running out of problems. Yeah?
No,
and so in that way, these things are opportunities.
We need all kinds of help, you're right. And what do you think world with AI would look in 10 years?
Oh, I think, look, if you want to look at the world in positive terms, and it's not the only way of looking at it, but it is a way of looking at it, then Marx, and we're all still under the shadow of Marx and his ideas, talked about how important the means of production are for really actualizing yourself as a being. And for a long time, the means of production were just in the hands of big capital. Mm-hmm. Now, with the internet, we put the means of production for disseminating what you want to talk about into the hands of individuals. And that's created great new challenges. It's also created incredible opportunities in terms of what we have in our pockets. Right. And now we have means of production. There's, for writing relatively well and articulating things, we're giving that to individuals also. And I think that will create, yes, fundamental new challenges in terms of how these things, this is an overused word, but how things get weaponized. But it'll also create opportunities. And I would hope that it also creates, for example, opportunities in Georgia to exploit, not exploit, that's the wrong word, but in building sustainable agriculture, in building things that up to now required access to knowledge that maybe people that didn't have access to. So, look, I mean, this could all go wrong in terrible ways, of course, also. Who knows? I mean, I'm not the person to know, but I think at least looking at this means of production and thinking that people should, as individuals, try and make the most of it. I hear a lot of hand-wringing, so to speak, about, oh, this is going to be terrible, that's going to be terrible. Well, maybe, but let's try and articulate and do good things. I've just used it recently to help me do my own tax declaration in some particular contexts. Perfect. And this is just a simple example.
Yeah, it's a great tool. Yeah, I agree. And finally, I have a question. Let's say you meet a total stranger anywhere in the world who has never heard of Georgia and asks you a question, why should I go to Georgia? What would your answer be?
Oh, well, my answer would be just come to Georgia, and there's so many things to see, and whatever you might be interested in, you're likely to find it. Now, yes, it's not Shanghai, it's not kind of Singapore, but if you're interested, of course, if you're interested in culture, if you're interested in history, if you're interested in meeting, also engaging with people, which here I think is possible. If you're interested in adventure sports, which some people are, then you can have that. If you want to have a quiet, kind of more leisurely time and just focusing on arts and wellness, you can do that. And maybe a good example, if I speak in direct terms, I mean, I was telling, many friends have visited me, and then last April, my cousin came with his entire family, and so these were the children, the 19, 20-year-olds, and the mother-in-law, the 80-year-old, right. And they had an amazing time, and they really loved it. And they went to Kakheti, they went up to Kazbegi, they were in Tbilisi. We went through some of the smaller museums, and they absolutely loved their time. And so several of my friends have come back many, many, many times. So there's something this is what a friend of mine who's also an Arabist had pointed out. He lived in the Emirates for a while. He said, there's one thing you cannot recreate just out of nothing, and that's an old culture. And you might have all the wealth from oil, but in the end, it's still going to be synthetic. Here, there's nothing synthetic about culture. It's actually really there, and in so many different layers. And this makes it an extraordinary place.
Well, I would like to thank you for appreciating my country so much, and so for helping us to promote Georgia around the world. It's very important to have friends like you, and let's hope Georgia is a much better place tomorrow, very soon in the future. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you. I've had the privilege of many great friendships in Georgia, and more than friendships, and so I feel very lucky in that way.
Great, thank you. Thank you for your time.